Welcome to this session presented by the Monitoring Group, titled The Rise of Anti-Chinese Racism, Building Resistance Over Fear. It's great to know so many of you have joined us today from around the world. That's the beauty of Zoom, as it connects us all from all corners of the globe. Please introduce yourselves in the chat so we know who's here with us. Before we start, there are just a few house rules, the boring stuff I know. We would be grateful if you could switch off your cameras if you don't want to be filmed, as this production will be recorded and posted on Facebook. Your mics are already muted. This is just so the meeting flows. Also, we would love to hear from as many of you as possible. So any questions for the speakers, please put in the chat. We've got a great panel of speakers tonight. Chi Chan and myself, Dorothea Jones, will be your co-chairs for this evening. I'm Dorothea. I'm from the Monitoring Group. I'll tell you a bit about the Monitoring Group. We were established in Southall, West London, in the early 1980s by young local community activists and lawyers seeking to challenge state misconduct and neglect, as well as all forms of racism. The Monitoring Group are recognised as one of the leading anti-racist organisations in the UK. We advocate on behalf of Black, Asian and migrant communities in their struggles for civil rights and state accountability. We've achieved this by creating and sustaining a unique hybrid model over the last 40 years, working in advocacy, grassroots community organising, public interest impact campaigns, and action, including litigation, to change discriminatory legislation, policies and practices. We at the Monitoring Group like to empower communities. We understand the structures and systems that support and perpetuate racism. We advocate on behalf of and empower clients suffering racial discrimination and hate crimes. The Monitoring Group have instigated research and evaluation projects and have participated in public inquiries that have examined the prevalence of racism and neglect within public bodies, which include the police, prisons, and care services. We help families to establish and lead campaigns. We have also helped establish self-organised and arts-based projects within Black, Asian, and minority ethnic communities to address injustice, representation, and marginalisation, and to empower racialised groups of our society. We have thousands of referrals a year from agencies, individuals, and families who have suffered racism, sometimes in very violent form. We've seen a huge rise in cases. Many more people referred to us are from the Chinese and East and Southeast Asian communities. The shocking rise started in December 2019 and has continued in exacerbation and violence. And that is what we'll be discussing tonight. Now it's over to you, Chi.
Thank you very much, Dorothea. Good evening, everybody. My name is Chi Chan. I have lived and worked in London since 1979. I'm a member of Min Quan. We are a community-based human rights organization founded in 1999 by activists in the community as a direct response to the wrongful arrest of 4 Chinese workers here in London who defended themselves against racist attacks. I'm also a trustee of Min Quan Legal Center. We provide advice on immigrations and community organizing. The founding aim of Min Quan is to defend the rights of British Chinese against racist attacks, also to hold authorities such as our police force to account to what was and still is wholly inadequate and often a negative response by them in defending members of our communities from racist attacks. To this day, British Chinese community are still neglected and sidelined by authorities when they come to matter concerning racial justice. We are the angry whisper, if you like, that do not get heard by the authority. The COVID-19 pandemic has, over the last year, given racists in Britain and in many other Western countries a further excuse, if excuse is needed, to denigrate our communities and in some instances, physically attack a member of our community, regardless of age, resulting in injuries and even death. We are here today to share our experience and to unite to find a way forward where our communities, wherever they are in the Western world, can live in peace. I'm going to introduce Bobby Chan, who's a founding member of Min Quan, and he'll say a few more words about the work that we do here in London. Bobby. You're muted, Bobby.
You're mute, Bobby.
Switch on your mic.
Yeah.
Okay.
Dear friends, comrades, welcome to all for joining this online meeting in discussing the rise of global anti-Chinese racism. My name is Bobby Chan. I am the ex-chair of Min Quan, an organization set up just before the year millennium, 2000, because of an immigration case, an important case that took place in London, Chinatown, the Diamond Restaurant. The case galvanized the Chinese community as racial harassment and attack on the Chinese community has been prevalent for many years, but were not being acknowledged. Although the Chinese waiters had been victims, the police in fact charged them. A national campaign to defend the Diamond Four was launched. We gathered mass support across the UK, and as a result, we forced the police and the CPS to drop all the charges against the waiters. Since then, as a result of the campaign, there is recognition that this is a vital form of organizing to systematically campaign and supporting the Chinese community's civil rights in the UK, and to monitor the actions of the police authorities. However, the racist attitudes towards the Chinese community continue to be stirred up periodically. For example, the case of the foot and mouth disease that happened in 2001, where the press and government in UK blamed the Chinese community for bringing the disease into this country without any evidence, even though in the end it was established that the problem was caused by farmers and their feeding procedures. Campaigns to support and protect the Chinese community are becoming common. And here we are not talking about so-called low-level racism. The Chinese communities have suffered all forms of racism, including murder. The murder of a Chinese takeaway owner, Mr. Mi Gao Wan Chung, near Wigan, is a tragic case in point. Mr. Gao, also known as Michael, and his girlfriend, Eileen Jia Ming Ya, had suffered many incidents of racial abuse and harassment. They called the police, but nothing was ever done. They installed their own CCTV and captured many incidents, but again, it led to nothing. Finally, on the 23rd of April, 2005, he was murdered. The CCTV image captured image of the whole incident, including the fatal moment, as well as his girlfriend's attempt to save her loved one. What do the police do? Arrested the offender, but also the girlfriend and charge. We campaigned to get the charges dropped against Eileen and succeed. However, I will always remember what the senior detective investigation told us at a case conference organized by the monitoring group. He said that police will not accept that the murder was racially motivated, even though the police themselves accept that racist language at the time when Mr. Wan Chung was being attacked. This is in 2005, only 5 years after Stephen Lawrence's inquiry report had been publicized, and every public authority have accepted that the definition of a racial incident. Unfortunately, the attack in the Chinese community continue, and sometimes this are driven by the British government-owned policies, including its racist immigration practice to check on so-called unauthorized worker by conducting fishing raids. There have been 3 major raids by the UKVI on Chinatown from October 2007, February 2014, and the latest one in July 2018. The first raid was caused by the Immigration Department office not only entering Chinatown to search so-called unauthorized worker, but also brought a BBC film crew to film the whole process. That enraged the Chinese community as it tried to criminalize the whole Chinese community. And we respond by organizing a strike, and Chinatown shut down when we met with the deputy head of Home Office, Southeast Region. Our action led to the early retirement of the department deputy head. The last raid took place in July 2018, when immigration officers were challenged by the local Chinese community when the immigration officer's vehicle almost run over a woman lying on the road. I believe you can view some of the confrontation on YouTube. In particular, there was a meeting organized by the Home Office to consult the Chinese community on immigration matter 1 week before the third raid that enraged our community. Over the past few years, racist abuse and attack on the Chinese community continue to increase. In particular, after the start of the pandemic in early 2020, when UK also began to suffer from the virus. The immediate problem of our community is that the police refuse to deal with our complaint of racism properly. That is the first major problem of racism against the Chinese community, as the police and the state institution do not protect the Chinese community in the UK. The second major problem is the increasing rhetoric against the China in its attempt to demonize the country. And as consequences, the Chinese community has become the scapegoat. I don't personally believe we can seriously deal with the first if we don't deal with the demonization of Chinese government using false information. The Chinese, Asian, and Southeast Asian communities will endure more racial attacks and harassment. We need to organize and protect ourselves with the slogan that self-defense is no offense, and link ourselves with the current struggle of all minorities in the UK. We have no illusion that the current government will do anything to assist us, as their new report to diminish the existence of institutional racism is moved to the wrong direction. Just one more thing. Recently, my daughter actually asked me, should I actually bring a weapon with me to protect myself in this country? This is how the young Chinese generation, the BBCs, basically British-born Chinese, actually begin to think that that is the only way to protect themselves in this country, because we can't depend on the government or the police. Thank you.
Thanks, Bobby. Thanks for that. I have to say that was a sobering account of how racism against the Chinese community is not dealt with. I remember the raids in Chinatown and the mobilizing of that community as well. So yeah, really interesting. Thanks so much. Now, I have the great pleasure of welcoming John McDonnell MP. John McDonnell served as the Shadow Chancellor of the Exchequer from 2015 to 2020. He's a member of the Labour Party and has represented the Hayes and Harlington constituency since 1997. So that's a whopping 24 years. His care for his constituents and commitment for progressive and socialist politics is acknowledged as legendary. So over to you, John.
Thank you, Dorothea, and thank you for inviting me. I apologize, I have to leave shortly to chair another meeting on an issue that's arisen in our area, but I will receive a full report of tonight's meeting and also the actions that you would like me to undertake in participating in the campaign that we will now clearly renew in terms of tackling the racism that the Chinese community faces. Let me just explain. I represent a West London constituency and have worked with the monitoring group from its very inception, and with Suresh Grover in particular, one of the founders. And only a few years ago, we were having a similar public meeting, which I spoke at, with regard to the way in which racism against the Chinese community was building at that time. And as has been explained by the past speakers, some of this racism is abhorrent in the extreme. Way back in 2009, Bobby Chan and Suresh Grover were involved in the commissioning of a report, an independent report, undertaken by Hull, Leeds and Nottingham, Trent universities into the racism against the Chinese community. And it was in the memory of Mr. Gao, who was the victim, the fatal victim of a brutal attack. And I just want to remind you of some of the findings of that report from 12 years ago. It found substantial levels of racist abuse, assault and hostility against the Chinese community. A significant underreporting because of the failure to distinguish Chinese people in any statistical analysis that was undertaken at the time. They were subsumed into a general ethnic minorities category. What was found was I thought, absolutely startling results of the psychological and physical impact of harassment and abuse, and yes, physical attacks on members of the Chinese community. But there were criticisms of the police, as Bobby Chan has said, not taking these matters seriously enough, but also the judicial system, and actually also the political system in not even acknowledging some of these issues existed. The Chinese members of the Chinese community felt that the police treated them as no priority when they became victims of this racism. And there was a lack of confidence both in the police and in the judicial and political system overall. We, in the work that we've undertaken throughout this period, I have to say, in this recent period, it's doubtful if there has been significant advances. Let's look at what's happened over the last 12 months, particularly during the pandemic. On the recent estimates, there's been a 300% increase in hate crimes against the Chinese community. Racist comments, physical attacks, and I found heartrending a recent BBC children's program, News Round, where students, young children were interviewed about how they felt and what they reported just through their natural conversations, that they were fearful of how they were being treated within the community because they were Chinese. And they reported bullying, being called names, and were fearful of their physical security. The N virus of racism, again, has highlighted even further the incidences of anti-Chinese racism that has taken place over this last 12 months. I have to say, some of this does stem from political interventions, particularly with regard to Donald Trump, where he described COVID as the Chinese virus, the China virus. It exacerbated the situation. In fact, it was inciting hatred, racism, and certainly was the resulted in racist abuse. It seemed to legitimize attacks on the community itself. My view now is that we need to ensure that we develop an appropriate strategy, as we did a number of years ago. First of all, to educate people about the incidents that are taking place. Secondly, to continue the work that the groups are making with regard to monitoring and reporting incidences, expose the seriousness of it as well, and challenge it, of course, and to seek a redress, both in terms of, yes, making sure the police are held accountable for taking actions against this, but also the judicial and political systems as well. What we need is enforcement, but enforcement that is properly resourced, but also the enforcement agencies held to account so that they are operating effectively. We also need representation, and certainly what my role will be to ensure that we raise issues like this in Parliament and directly with government ministers, because I want to reiterate what Bobby Chan has said. And in some instances over this recent period in particular, because of the activities of this government, there's a feeling amongst the Chinese community, as amongst others, that there's a hostile environment. And some of that stems from the nationality policies that are being pursued by the current government. But of course, what we need to do is give as much support and advice and assistance to individuals and groups throughout. Overall, I think there's one message that should come from this meeting, is that we stand in solidarity together against this rise of racism against the Chinese and South Asian community. I believe now there's a seriousness of intent that we have to ensure that we come together in all walks of life to, yes, expose, but confront and redress the situation as it now is, and to prevent it becoming even worse. Solidarity.
Thank you very much, John. Thank you for your contribution, and I hope you have a nice evening. The next speaker that is a social science student, Lucian Wu, who's had, with friends, founded a group called Asian Unity Over Fear. Lucian is a British Chinese student, and I won't say any more. I will let her speak for herself and see tell you what she has been doing. Lucian.
Yeah, thanks for the introduction, Chi. It's really nice to see everyone. Good evening. I just want to thank everyone for coming together far and wide from your various screens. I know not everyone is familiar with online meetings, so it means all the more to have gathered here this evening. My name's Lucian. I'm a student at King's College London. I'm 19. I grew up in Reading, born in Kent, and my parents came over in the 90s, so that's a bit of background to give you some context. I grew up in a Chinese restaurant, and it served both northern and southern food, so no qualms or quarrels with anybody here as to what food is better. I'm here tonight also as a representative from Asian Unity Over Fear to speak about where we can all stand on this issue and what we can do collectively to help, but also what we can do as individuals. Asian Unity Over Fear is an anti-racist organization campaigning for the meaningful recognition of the experiences faced by East and Southeast Asian people in the UK. ESEA stands for East and Southeast Asian because Chinese people are not the only ones who have suffered as a result of anti-Chinese rhetoric. As long as one is perceived to be Chinese, one can experience xenophobic discrimination, and I will explain more on what meaningful recognition means later on. But as you can see, a lot of the victims from the xenophobic discrimination attacks have been Filipino, they've been Korean, they've been any other form of identity that attackers can interpret as Chinese, right? So our group formed in March this year when a group of friends and myself felt a collective snap of what Sarah Ahmed calls it, after seeing what happened to Dr. Peng Wang, who is here tonight to tell his story. Our snap came as a result of the emotions we pent up, of pain, of sadness, and of anger that many of you must have felt as well when seeing these things on online media. We saw yet another member of our community get hurt, and we were fed up. As a child of immigrants and a third culture kid, as many call it, when you feel not entirely Chinese, not entirely English or British, and being raised in a Chinese restaurant, I've learned some truths about growing up Asian in Britain that I want to share with you. There is a weight to being non-white in this country, and a weight that many of you will know tonight from experience. And it comes with obstacles when you have this identity. As Asians, we are defined by terms that we have had no say in, and viewed through a lens of what theorist Frantz Fanon calls the white gaze. We are vilified, for example, with yellow peril. We are sexualized, see yellow fever, and stereotyped through a model minority myth that boxes us into a life that we didn't choose. The West likes to play with us when we are fun, eat with us when we cook, and ignore our pain along with our mere existence when we are hurt and have the nerve to say something about it. And I say all this because it's in the context of what these attacks happen in and the scenery among which our stories are painted. We are sometimes disposable when we are no longer enjoyed for us and our culture, and sometimes we are invisible whilst being hypervisible. The abuse that the Chinese and Asian community faces comes as a result of how we are perceived by the country we're in and what we are recognized to be. We discuss this all the time at the virtual meetings we set up with Asian Unity Over Fear, where many of us were brought to tears, not just from the nature of what we are discussing, but because it was the first time we got to speak amongst our own community about these issues. Seeing people older than me in my community cry was definitely a wake-up call. This is no longer the time for silence and brushing issues under the carpet. In Chinese, we would call it 我们不能自扫门前雪, which means we can't just sweep the snow in our own front porch. Instead, we should remember that 众人拾柴火焰高, which in English means when we all do our part to chip in wood to the fire, the flame can then burn higher and brighter. I know we might understand the silence that permeates through the Asian community, and we know that it's difficult sometimes to speak up. It can be very difficult and exhausting considering the amount of media that we are all absorbing, right? We see a lot of images and videos of people who look like us being harmed. I want to remind everyone that that's not normal and that shouldn't be acceptable. And it might benefit you if you try it to consume less media or open less videos and pictures that could be distressing to you and add to your overall mental weight. But I just want as well to emphasize tonight before I go that things we can do are unlimited and the hope is not lost. Because among us tonight, there are some amazing activists. They've campaigned against racism for many years, but years are not necessarily needed for one to participate in activism. The media likes to show protests and marches, but those aren't the only ways you can do something to help. And the activism I want to emphasize is the resistance we can all practice in our daily lives. Try and have conversations that might be difficult. Try and highlight to others ways that your life is affected that they may not have seen. And if you're not Chinese tonight and you're not Asian and you're not affected by this, try and reflect and acknowledge what your peers are going through. And for those of us at the organization, coming together was all we needed to realize that when the anger and dismay that we felt was combined, when all the emotion was put together, we could channel it to find the strength to help mobilize the change our community needs to see. So I want everyone tonight, you're going to hear some very moving speakers, to not just experience and feel the emotion, but try and put it towards something that can mobilize you. Thank you for giving me the platform today, the monitoring group. And yeah, I hope everyone learned something.
Oh my goodness, Lucian, that was an amazing speech, incredibly powerful. Thank you so much for your activism and for mobilizing the young in the EASA communities. Incredible stuff, honestly, that was so moving. Next, I have the pleasure of introducing Dr. Ping Hao. Ping graduated in physics and obtained a PhD in optoelectronics from the University of Southampton. Ping has been with the university since 1990. She currently is an academic member of the university. As a volunteer, Ping has served the local Chinese community for over 20 years. She is a board member of the monitoring group. She joined as an advisor for the monitoring group's project Min Quan in 1999, while she was the president of the Chinese Students and Scholars Association in Southampton. She led the association working with local statutory agencies to combat racial harassment and injustice facing the students. Ping was the co-founder of the Chinese Association of Southampton and was the chair of the association from 2002 to 2011. Ping is also the founder and director of Chinese Arts Southampton, a Chinese music and dance group unique to Southampton and its region. The aims of the group are to promote Chinese art and culture and to enable the local Chinese community to contribute towards the cultural diversity of Southampton and the surrounding region, to raise awareness and understanding of Chinese art and culture amongst all communities. The group has taken part in various concerts and projects, which has helped improve mutual understanding and harmony in all our communities. Welcome, Ping.
Thank you, Dorothy, for your introduction. Good evening, everyone. Thank you for coming to this public forum and your support. Okay, racism against the Chinese community is not a new phenomena in the British society. There were reports of race riots targeting Chinese business and the Chinese laundry as early as 1919, more than 100 years ago. I have been living in UK for over 30 years. And sometimes when there is national disaster, in the country, the Chinese community would very likely become the scapegoat. As Bobby already mentioned, we witnessed a spike of racist incident against the Chinese community during the foot-and-mouth disease crisis in 2001, due to the unfounded accusation that the disease was a spread caused by a Chinese restaurant using illegal imported meat. The causes of racism against Chinese community in UK has a long history. The Chinese exclusion sentiment in the Western countries, Western societies has actually existed for hundreds of years. In the early years, similar to the way the Black people were treated, certain discriminating legislation against Chinese were adopted in some Western countries, such as Australia, Canada, and the United States, which prohibited Chinese from taking decent jobs or eating in the same restaurant with white people, etc. The situation hasn't changed much even now. During the early time of a COVID-19 pandemic, China has warned the world about the seriousness of the virus. Most Western media, instead of paying attention and educate their people about the terrible nature of the virus, but they were spreading lots of rumors, such as eating Chinese food will get sick. Only Chinese people get the virus. Keeping away from Chinese, you are all right, etc. This kind of attack on Chinese community behavior was terrifying, and it has a profound impact. For example, despite receiving a lot of Chinese medical aid, such as PPEs and help from Chinese medical teams, many people from some Western country demanded that China should apologize for the virus, even proposed the China Bill of Compensation. There has been many pandemics around the world in the past, such as AIDS, Ebola, H1N1, the swine flu, etc. Most of them were first detected actually in the United States, but we never heard any apologies from the US, never mind the compensation. Most Chinese wear masks in the public domain when the pandemic started in order to protect themselves as well as others from spreading or catching the virus. But the people in UK may think wearing masks was abnormal and not necessary. This demonstrated that the people lack of the health protection awareness. However, many Chinese people wearing masks when actually become targeted as racial abuse and attacks. So in the evening of the 17th of March last year, one of my students at the University of Southampton called me that there has been a virtual attack at the entrance of his student dormitory. Some Chinese students were verbally and physically assaulted by a gross of youth. And the glass door and the furniture of the reception area were also smashed. I told him to call the police and get a witness and collect the evidence. He said that the police had already involved, but the students were not convinced with the way the police dealing with the situation. The incident was recorded as a hate crime and reported on BBC local news and over 30 Chinese media sources around the world. 4 Chinese students were wearing masks and went out to get some food that night in town. So they encountered with a group of youths who shouted at them, Chinese virus, go back to China, and physically attacked them. The students were followed by the gun from the town center, city center, to their dormitory, and the abuse and attack continues until the police arrived. So I was told by the police that there were 9 suspects arrested or interviewed at the end of the march, but no further action had been taken. I contacted all the victims and liaised with the monitoring group. Victims signed the consent. The monitoring group contacted the police on behalf of all victims and asked for an urgent case conference in May. But the police made unacceptable and lame excuses. All victims completed their studies, and the 3 of them went back to China in July last year, and 1 went back in September. The investigation officer of the case had never contacted the victim from the time the incident took place until they left the country. So with the consent of all victims, the monitoring group lodged a formal complaint against the police on the following grounds. The police have failed to contact and inform the victims and failed to obey by its victim policy. The police have refused to recognize the victims' representatives despite their policies, practice, and legislation. The police have failed to conduct an effective investigation that is open and transparent. The complainants reserve the right to submit additional grounds. The Professional Standards Department replies with acknowledgement letter and the complaint summary in October. Finally, 3 of the 12 arrested suspects were charged, with 1 pleaded not guilty, and the trial will take place next week. And 2 were charged with 2 counts of racially and religiously assault. Both get the same sentences, participate 3 sessions in restorative justice, and pay £21 to fund victim services. In February this year, my colleague, Dr. Peng Wan, a lecturer at Southampton University, was racially attacked while jogging near his home in Southampton. A group of 4 men shouted Chinese virus, go back to China, and punched and kicked him to the ground, and then run away. It has been 3 months now. I think police did make an arrest, but no one was charged so far. So in my view, if police had taken a more swift action in getting justice done in time of the March incident last year, or any similar incident, and promoting positive outcomes through media, raising public awareness, Dr. Wang's terrible experience would have been avoided. Southampton Stand Up to Racism group and the Chinese Association organized an online public event showing support and solidarity with Dr. Wang after the incident took place. At the event, Mr. Jin from London reviewed his horrific experience of being an acid attack by 2 suspects, only because he is a Chinese. We were aware that many racially motivated attacks against the East Asian community, such as people or students from Singapore, Japan, Thailand, Korea, and other Southeast Asian countries, they were mistakenly identified as Chinese by perpetrators. Some of them were beaten up by perpetrators and were shouted as Chinese virus. So Mr. Jin's horrific experience tells us that the perpetrators now try to identify their victims are Chinese before starting actually their attack. Finally, I would like to advise that if an incident happened to you or your friends, please do report. Get witness and collect evidence. Make sure the police are accountable. Be vigilant when a stranger asks you if you are Chinese. Stay strong and stay safe. Thank you. Okay, now I would like to introduce Dr. Wang. Dr. Peng Wang was a victim, as I mentioned, of a racial attack in Southampton, February this year. He is a lecturer in financial management in the Southampton University, University of Southampton. Over to you, Dr. Wang.
Thank you. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Yes.
So thank you, Pinghua, for inviting me to this excellent event. First of all, I want to thank for the organizing this event. So I just want to briefly describe, the horrible experience that I suffered in late February, and then I want to say something about my thoughts over it. So it was 23rd of February. It was a Tuesday. I went out jogging like a normal day. So I have the habit of going out for jogging. So the time was around 4 p.m. So you know that in late February for 4 p.m. it was still bright, and it was only like 1 minute walk from my home, then on a street which called the Wasper Road. So I heard somebody shouting at me. This guy sat behind the driver in the car that on the other side of the road. He shouted at me by saying like Chinese virus and dirty words. So immediately I realized it's definitely a racist attack. Then I shouted back. So I shouted back, and then they drove away. I took some deep breaths and kept jogging. So surprisingly and appallingly, they circled back. So actually we encountered twice. So the first time was just short, but the second time, the second time was on Victoria Road. When I was turned left, then they circled back. So I got extremely angry. So I said, so why did you shout at me and get out of the car? So then then there are 4 guys. So they got out of the car and attacked me on the ground. So I was helped by some witnesses nearby. There was a nice lady who called the police and reported the car plate number to the police. And another lady, saw that I was in a very, very bad state, and she called the ambulance. So later the ambulance, the paramedic, they came, and I got some treatment, and later I was taken to the hospital. So unfortunately, the police officer, they didn't come at the first spot. So the latest, the recent update is around 2 weeks ago. The Southampton police officer told me that they have already submitted the case to CPS, because this case is definitely a criminal, is hate crime. So normally for criminal cases, then the CPS will sue the crime if they believe that they have convictions, they have the enough evidence to sue the crime to so they act as a state. So still yet I haven't got anything back. So hopefully I will hear from the CPS maybe in 1 week time. Normally they will need 21 days, as the police officer told me, for CPIs to make the final decision. So the incident was unfortunate, but however, the fortunate thing is that I didn't got very bad injury. So I recovered very well, and also I didn't get my bone broken. So my thought was that this attack is not the first attack in Southampton after the pandemic. As Dr. Hua told, so we had 4 students were followed by some teenagers, in the city center for at least 50 meters, and then the student got attacked, first verbally abused and attacked. So, however, that incident didn't affect anything, didn't raise concerns of the public, and also didn't raise concern of the university, of the community. So that's the reason why it happened another time. And I believe it's not the second time. I believe there are many unreported cases. This time happened just because I challenged them, right? And they have the guts, to come back to me because I challenged them. So I just wondering, what happened to the society, right? So obviously there's something has to be done, to educate people, because as far as I know, in the UK there's a harsher law if the attack is identified, by hate crime. Normally, if you are found guilty, you will spend more years in the prison. And I don't know why people they want to do this. So because the maximum sentence could be 7 years. So I believe something needs to be done, from higher level, maybe from the council level, from the state level, to educate people. This is a criminal. On the other hand side, like the Chinese social science student, I pretty much agree, right? So we shouldn't just clean the snow on our home. I mean, the last thing we want to do is keep silence. Right, so we should stand up. We should report the cases. We should stand up on the first spot. So, but anyway, that's my thought on the terrible incidents. And still, thank you very much for this event, and solidarity with you.
Thank you very much for your contribution, and I see that you have recovered mostly from your injury. You're quite right to say that we must not stay silent. I think the older generation from our community, and this is also the experience of other Asian community, and also previously the Black community. We had years ago, they think that if you don't say anything, people, these people will go away. Of course, our experience would tell us that this is not the case. So not staying silent and react is obviously we have to do it collectively to be on the safe side. Our next speaker is Christina Wan, who's joining us from the United States. Christine is a PhD candidate in sociology at the University of Pittsburgh. She's also a member of a project manager for a organization called AAPI, which stands for Asian American Pacific Islander and Native Hawaiian Communities. Is that correct?
Yes.
Yeah.
Thank you.
So we welcome you from across the pond. And only today that I have learned that your Congress has passed a legislation, which is I understand President Biden have signed into law a hate crime bill, which is great for you.
Yes, Representative.
So I'll give you the floor.
Great, thank you so much. And I'm going to start sharing my screen and hopefully everybody can see that. Okay. Yeah, so thank you to Pinghua for inviting me and also the monitoring group for coordinating this event. I feel very honored to be sort of the US representative to explain how Asian Americans and Asian migrants are experiencing the pandemic in the States. And so I'm currently calling in from unceded Nice Island land, or what is currently known as Sacramento, California, on the west coast of the US. And I'm really glad to be sharing with you what the AAPI COVID-19 project is, and then the recent ways that the visible rise of anti-Asian violence are impacting Asian and Asian American communities in the US. As many of the speakers have already talked about, this wave of violence is not necessarily new, but it is perhaps more visible, maybe because of social media and other particular reasons like that. And so in the US, it's currently Asian Pacific American Heritage Month, so it feels really good to be able to speak with you all today during this time. These physical forms of violence that have increased during COVID-19, as I said, is not new. And us, our project members at the AAPI COVID-19 project are also interested in not just this form of physical violence that you're seeing on the news, but also the kinds of structural violence and political forms of violence that have been exacerbated during the pandemic. So in the US, there, according to Stop AAPI Hate, which is a reporting center where people can call in or write in and do self-reported incidences of hate, there have been reported to be upwards of 6,600 hate reports from March of last year to March of this year. And these range from verbal harassment to physical assaults or physical violence. And approximately 64% of these cases are from women. And so these numbers are really important for us to understand, especially as we know many Asian migrants and Asian Americans are less likely to report hate incidences than other racial groups. But we are also interested in understanding actually what these numbers actually mean. So the project that I'm part of, which is the AAPI COVID-19 project, which stands for Asian American Pacific Islander, is a multidisciplinary mixed methods research study led by 11 different researchers who identify as Asian or Asian American and were from across 7 different research universities in the US. And we're interested in uncovering the many ways that COVID-19 is impacting our communities, not just the kinds of physical violence, but also these other impacts that we might not necessarily be considering. So we do this through 2 main research methods, which are qualitative interviews with people who identify as Asian immigrants, Asian American, Native Hawaiian, and or Pacific Islander. In the US, we tend to lump all of these racial groups or ethnic groups together. In the UK, I believe it's very different. You probably don't group in Native Hawaiian or Pacific Islander under the broad Asian label, but in the US, we do, which presents its own kind of problems when analyzing the kinds of hate violence that we experience. But the first round of qualitative interviews that we did took place from summer of last year to October of last year. So even before this more recent rise that's been in the media this past year. And then we also do a quantitative survey with folks who identify as Asian American and folks who do not, to understand how other racial groups perceive Asians and Asian Americans. So in the context of the US, Asians and Asian Americans represent a wide diversity of ethnic groups. There's over 50 ethnic groups represented in the US, with people speaking over 40 different languages. And so because of this, we wanted to know actually how different ethnic groups are actually experiencing what we call anti-Asian violence. And it's not necessarily, as Lucian talked about, not just against Chinese people or people who are descended from China, but people who others perceive as being Chinese or perceive as being East Asian. So even prior to the pandemic, this data is from 2019, Pew Research Center. Even before the pandemic happened, Asians and Asian Americans already believed that they were experiencing a rise of discrimination. 76% of people surveyed believed that. And so we were interested in seeing how the pandemic actually might have elevated this. So we do this through looking at 6 main research areas, and currently our project has 2 active studies on labor and the economy, and then also family and caregiving. So how is the pandemic impacting those parts of our lives? So just to give some context, in the US, the group of Asian Americans have a wide range of income levels. Some speakers reference the model minority myth, which posits that Asians and Asian Americans have high attainment levels and high income levels, so we shouldn't really worry about them. They're the minorities that we should strive to become, essentially. But actually that paints a false picture, because actually Asians and Asian Americans make a range of income levels, they have a range of educational attainment levels, and this myth actually makes it harder for us to actually put in place social safety nets that would help safeguard against kinds of economic violence that Asian American communities face on a regular basis. Because the COVID-19 pandemic is spread through airborne, spread through the air, it's important to understand that Asians actually make up a lot of what we would consider high-risk industries or public-facing industries. And so because of this, we were also interested in understanding like what kinds of work protections were put in place for people of Asian descent who primarily work in those kinds of industries. So in some of the data that we've collected and interviews that I've conducted myself, we found that Asian American, Asian migrants that we've interviewed experienced differential types of responses to economic relief that our government tried to put in place during the pandemic. So if you look at the second quote, primarily this it was from a Thai American student. She was a college student, and she was talking about how she lives in a multi-generational household, and Asians in the US live in multi-generational households at a higher rate than other racial groups. And so she was talking about how her dad was because of the pandemic, she and her mother were laid off of work, and that their father became the sole financial provider. But because he worked in a restaurant industry, his hours were cut. So he isn't actually technically unemployed, which is, you could apply for unemployment benefits in the US, but because he was employed but with just cut hours, she didn't know, and her family didn't know, if the CARES Act, which is the legislation put in place to help financially support people during the pandemic, she didn't know if the CARES Act would actually help support them. So she didn't want to, she and her family didn't want to spend the time to apply for these applications when they didn't know if anything would actually come of it. So all of these things, this kind of economic uncertainty, and also people have been speaking about this kind of physical violence that has risen both in the UK and for me in the US. It could be really, for lack of a better word, very depressing and really debilitating to think constantly about. So our project team also is interested in how Asian American and Asian communities are actually doing positive things and cultivating care for one another, because government structures are not able to do that for them. So the people we interviewed talked about how they were forced to build their own networks of support that were not readily available to them because of the government, and also that they didn't need prior to the pandemic. But the pandemic actually forced them to, or required them to, create these kinds of community care networks that made it easier for them or helped them through living their life during the pandemic. So a Filipino American interviewee who identified themselves as being more introverted and never really needing like a large social network before the pandemic talked about how actually during the pandemic, they really wanted to connect with other people. So they were able to volunteer online with organizations, and how that volunteer work actually became a lifeline. So they weren't socially isolated or feeling depressed. A Korean woman who was a professor, but from Korea, talked about how her colleagues who are also from other countries in Asia, how because of sort of closed border policies with the US during the height of the pandemic, they weren't able to go back to their home countries as they normally would during the summertime. So they actually made the decision to gather, socially distantly in each other's backyard, to just be with each other, talk about what was happening in their home countries in terms of COVID, but also just to get away from all of the rhetoric surrounding the pandemic and surrounding anti-Asian violence. And then lastly, something that I think is really, really interesting is how Asian and Asian American communities used PPE as a form of community care. So a woman I talked to who is Chinese and had family still in China, and she was born and raised in China, but was living in the US and had a white husband who at the time when COVID was really hitting China in February, her husband didn't understand why she was so concerned. And she said she would stay really late at night trying to coordinate mass donations to send to their sister city in China. But then in March last year, when the pandemic really hit the US, actually their sister city said, never mind, you need the masks more than we do, so we're going to send them all back to you. So to us at the project, it exemplifies this form of international kind of solidarity that we wouldn't understand in those terms if it wasn't for speaking to this woman. And then also a Chinese American woman spoke about how she coordinated making masks with other people to provide to vulnerable community members and to provide to people who were protesting during the height of the Black Lives Matter protests of last year. So using PPE as a form of protecting one another is something that we think is really interesting and really something that is not really covered in the media. So if anyone is interested in learning more, I had to condense a lot of the findings, but if anyone's interested in learning more, there's a preliminary resource guide and report that we published in March, and I can drop that link in the chat box. And then also we're still looking for people to be considered for interviews. So even if you don't live in the US, we're still interested in understanding how Asians, Asian Americans, Native Hawaiians, and Pacific Islanders are experiencing the pandemic, again, even if you're not from the US. So I will close there, and I thank you again for allowing me to use this platform.
Thank you so much for that, Christina. Really fascinating to hear what's going on in the US and to hear the context. We hear that often over here as well, the model minority myth, and knowing that the EASA communities, as we term them here, are heteronormative and not homogenous or one monolithic group. Analysis and research is extensive, and it seems like you're carrying out quite a lot. I just want to say thank you. I'm glad it's not so early where you are in the US, and thank you so much for taking time out to join us. Then our next guest this evening is Deo Tran. She is a client who contacted us at the monitoring group. Deo is the mother of Austin, who is still at primary school, so he's very, very young. Austin was racially assaulted on the 22nd of April. So that was, only last month. And he suffered a serious injury to his eye. Really, really horrible stuff. Welcome, Deo, to tell us more. Thank you.
Thank you. Yes, just to tell you the story, we live in North London in a middle-class neighborhood. And we are of Chinese ethnicity, but also American expatriates. My son in primary school was playing football at a local park, and 4 boys from a secondary school joined the game. The older boys racially abused him. They made ching, chang, chong noises. Then one of them calls my son ugly bitch and violently kicks my son in the eye. After assaulting him, they continued with the racial abuse. I was in such a panic. We took my son to A&E, to the emergency. We found out that my son lost over 50% vision in his left eye for weeks. The back of the retina was bruised, is what the doctor told us. We reported the crime to the secondary school and to the police. The secondary school did nothing. In fact, the head of year chose to defend the perpetrators by calling them beautiful boys. The school investigated and took the boy's story that it was simply an accident with a football. I told the school that a football cannot do this type of damage to an eye. Only something pointed, like a football boot, can push an eye into the head with such incredible force to bruise the back of the eye. I told them my son could have irreparable damage to his vision. The school didn't listen or care. A police constable came and met with us in our home and chatted with us about the hate crime. He didn't take down a statement, nor did he have us sign an official report of some kind. It was just a chat. Then he told us that he was going to give this investigation to the school police officer. I was able to speak to the police officer at the school, and once again, the school police officer defended those perpetrators and agreed that the story was about a football. And once again, I corrected him. I said it was not a football, it was a football boot. He then tells me that he's going to speak with the investigating officer, who is the same police constable that came to speak with us in our home. And, you know, he told me, the school police officer told me that he would get back to us after he speaks to that officer. But he never gets back to me. So then I try to contact him, but he ignores my multiple attempts. So finally, I go back to the investigating police constable, the one that chat with us in our home. And he didn't take us very seriously. He said because these suspects were 13, 14 years old, that he was going to close the case. I objected, and I stated to him that criminal responsibility in the UK is age 10. Then this wasn't all of it, you know. Just a few days ago, my son went back to the same park, and a primary school boy this time repeats the same racial assault towards my son. One of the things he called my son was Chinese boy, and then tries to kick him in the face and punch him. This primary school boy is imitating the racial assault from the first hate crime. We report this second incident to the same police constable. Then, you know, this incident feels like retaliation for the first hate crime because the method of attack is so similar. It's now been a month, and there has been no contact by the police to get a proper statement. I believe an investigation can't begin without a proper statement. You know, first, I believe the investigating police constable has been using these delay tactics and avoiding duty of care. First, the case was given to the school police officer. Then it was given to the safeguarding police officers. And now it's supposed to be given to the criminal investigation department. According to this police constable, someone will be contacting us as soon as possible. And each time the case changes hands, a week goes by and no real progress has been made. I just get these promises in emails. And, you know, I just want people to be aware that hate crimes are happening to young people, not just to adults. Schools and police are ignoring these hate crimes because of the age of the perpetrators. You know, I believe age should not matter when it's a hate crime, especially with actual bodily harm. You know, my son's eye was damaged. I really do encourage all of you to please report every hate crime, even if you think nothing will be done and no one will listen. Because, you know, one day something more significant can be done, but we need this data of reported hate crimes to get us there. Thank you so much to the monitoring group for helping us. I really would like to get Austin some justice. And thank you all for listening.
Thank you so much, Dad. That was really emotional. I remember taking your call, and I remember just how angry I was when I heard what had happened to your son, and just how the school had dismissed the violent attack that he'd suffered. This should not be happening in 2021 in this country to our children. It just should not, and it needs to stop. But thank you so much for telling your story. We really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Next up, we would have had Claire Waxman, who's the Mayor's Office Victims Commissioner for London. I'm so sorry to have to deliver the news that Claire Waxman is unable to attend tonight. She sends her sincerest apologies. Her policy advisor, Max, let us know that she was unable to attend late this morning. I'm just going to read very quickly part of the email. I'm sorry for the late notice of this email. However, a personal issue has arisen for Claire today. That means she is unable to attend this evening's event. She will be in touch herself in the next few days. I do hope this evening's event goes well and that there are some fruitful discussions on this issue. And indeed, there have been some very fruitful discussions on this issue. We wish Claire all the best. So without further ado, over to Chi to introduce the next speaker.
Hi. Hi. Before the next speaker, I would just like to add a little thing. First of all, I'm really sorry to hear about Dale's son's experience. Speaking as a parent myself, I know how horrendous it is, especially when the child is young. And I hope that she will get the justice that her son will get the justice that they deserve. I just want to add a little bit of statistic when Christina was speaking. Her organization AAPI collected the data from last year of 6,600 of hate crime against Asian Chinese. To give everybody a bit of context, one of the news channel in America have reported 2019 for the whole of the United States, from every community, FBI collected 7,000 hate crime. That's the whole of the United States. So it gives you an idea that the scale of the problem that our brothers and sisters over in America is experiencing. And as I understand, a similar thing is happening in Canada as well. So our next speaker is Suresh. Suresh is the director of TMG monitoring group, and I don't really need to introduce Suresh that much, and I will just give Suresh the floor.
Yeah, thank you, Chi. There's no question that we have to agree with what everyone has said. The racism suffered by the Chinese and Southeast Asian communities in this country is nothing new. I do believe something sinister is happening, and we need to recognize that. It's not the fact that the Chinese are suffering racism for the first time. We know that's not true. The monitoring group has been in existence for 40 years, and since our inceptions, we've been dealing with cases of what is now perceived to be hate crimes. And when the Min Quan project was established by our Chinese members, people have already spoken about the quantity and the quality of cases that we dealt with. What COVID-19 has done is expose the fault lines that existed before. And if you look at the recent YouGov poll into racism, what it actually shows is not that the Chinese communities, and I use the abbreviation Southeast Commission and Chinese communities, are suffering racism for the first time, but actually what it shows is that the Chinese people from Chinese background living in the UK are actually more exposed to racist comments than any other BME community in Britain. The data collected by YouGov interviewed over 1,200 people from different sections of our BME communities about issues of racism in the UK in June, July, August last year. It found that 76% of ethnic Chinese questioned said that they'd experienced someone using a racial slur directly against them on at least one occasion. 60% said that this had happened in multiple times. This is much higher average than for other BME communities. The report was released at the moment when UK was being forced to come to terms with its history of colonialism and modern day manifestations of racism when BLM-inspired protests continued to spread across the world. In total, results showed that 84% of Black minority ethnic people interviewed thought that racism still existed in the UK today. And 70% of the Chinese people said that they had experienced racism, and not 70, 79% of Chinese people said that they had experienced racism. People from ethnic Chinese backgrounds also more likely than any other minority group, both to report someone imitating their accent, and Dao has explained what has happened to her little child, the Ching Chang comments that come all the time, and makes assumptions about their behavior based on their ethnicity. The COVID tragedy, the COVID conditions have increased anti-Chinese racism, so much so that the United Nations has expressed concerns what they call the tsunami of hatred and xenophobia unleashed by the pandemic. And they have warned, human rights organizations across the globe have warned that some government leaders, including our own in this country, are helping to fan the flames by employing anti-Chinese rhetoric. So in reality, we know what the racism against Chinese is nothing new. At a micro level, from our figures at work, we witnessed a dramatic spike in racial abuse, harassment, violence, what are considered to be race hate crimes. The police have shown an increase of 29, 30, 31%, 59% by different media outlets of racism suffered by Chinese. We've seen in the monitoring group something like 1,000% increase in the last 10 months to 12 months. This is a tsunami of hatred in this country. It's not usual. There is something developing, something existing that we need to confront. And it starts from the Brexit campaign in this country, which is the most anti-immigrant rhetorical national campaign. And the COVID stuff and the COVID rhetoric has engulfed other sections of BME communities into that foray. So the rhetoric against Chinese people have become even more pronounced than it existed before. John, has spoken about incidents. I mean, we're not talking about just attacks. It's the violent nature of the attacks. Who kicks a 6-year-old boy with a football boot saying Ching Chang? I was stabbed when I was young by skinheads. I know the alarming consequences that can have, but not as a 6-year-old boy. And then that being repeated again. We have grotesque incidents where a Japanese woman in Orpington, Southeast London, is greeted by ni hao, a greeting of hello in Chinese, and then 3 men urinate on her while she's trying to pass by her. There's a trend of not just racism and racial abuse, which encompasses harassment at a different level, from arson attacks to graffitis to criminal damage and physical assaults, but there's a trend in our casework targeting Oriental, so-called Oriental women, and I put that in inverted commas because that's what's been said, using both racial and sexual slurs. It's important to recognize that, and I'll come to that in a minute. But before I do that, I think it's important to recognize what John McDonnell had said earlier and referred to the report that we published in 2009. We called it hidden from public view because the Chinese community were deliberately being hidden away from public view, from the mainstream radio station, from the mainstream television stations, from the mainstream media, perpetuating a myth that they are self-reliant, they do not want to engage with people, they have gatekeepers, and therefore will not talk to the so-called host community, positive so-called stereotypes that They excel in education, so they don't suffer racism. And when we had cases of attacks on Chinese waiters, we were told, well, we don't believe that they didn't defend themselves because most Chinese can engage in kung fu and all the kind of stuff. The same negative stereotypes that are used against Black people as superhuman, people with superhuman strength, so the violence is used against by the police against them. That document, that report, offered a rare insight into the plight of Chinese victims in at least 3 towns in this country: London, Southampton, and Manchester, the capital, a northern city, and a port where the Chinese business existed. And it gave a harrowing description of what it was like for Seoul Chinese restaurant being set upon day after day by people who hated Chinese people running that restaurant. They were not safe because of the businesses and the housing were linked in the same premises, living upstairs. So even when they left their businesses, went upstairs to their flat, they suffered the same continuous 24/7 harassment perpetrated against them. The impact of racial abuse on those people, on these people, many of us we've heard here, ranging from, Lucian has explained, serious psychological impact, safety of their family, safety of their children, hospitalization, loss of businesses leading to poverty and even death. And, you know, the report makes recommendations similar to the Lawrence. We were involved in this Lawrence case and the Stephen Lawrence inquiry. And we used some of the examples of the Stephen Lawrence case to develop an effective response for the Chinese and Southeast Asian communities. The report was launched by the current mayor of London, Sadiq Khan, who was the Minister of Communities and Local Government. He supported those recommendations. The only people who opposed them were the senior officers who refused to believe, and discussions we had in Parliament with them, that Chinese communities could suffer disproportionate forms of racism. They continue to refuse to believe that, despite the evidence. At a micro level, there are a number of other arenas which I just want to raise for a couple of minutes, and that I think require, from the work that Min Quan and the monitoring group has done, greater acknowledgement and understanding of people who wish to challenge racism, especially anti-Chinese racism, in the current environment. And I just want to illustrate this by giving a number of examples, and just bear with me because they're based, I just want to develop an analysis from the actual concrete experiences. You know, Bobby's already explained the case of Mr. Michael Migao, killed on 23rd of April, 2005, murdered by a gang of 20 white youths outside his takeaway catering unit in Wigan, Lancashire. And according to his partner, Eileen Jai, the tragedy was a culmination of a targeted campaign of harassment against them both. They asked for help from the police, from the local authorities, from local business units, everyone you can think of for years, and the calls were unanswered. The killing itself was witnessed by a number of individuals. They, not just Eileen, but the chef who worked there. It's on CCTV camera. We have the CCTV camera. It captured the events leading to the killing. It recorded not only the violent intent of the assailants, but also the desperate attempts of Eileen and the chef to save Michael's life, including the calls they were making to the police and Eileen's brave attempt to get a stick and try and prevent the murder to taking place. What happened? Eileen got charged while trying to defend her husband's, her boyfriend's or partner's murder. When I met her a couple of days after the murder, She was obviously in a state of shock. And Eileen was determined to fight for justice. She felt betrayed by everyone. She was angry that the racial motive wasn't being taken seriously. And we campaigned for the charges to be dropped, and we succeeded in that. But the point I want to make is this. All the horror, as if that is not enough, after Michael was murdered, Eileen was on her own for several months looking after the business, serving the same racists that had attacked her for years and killed her. You know what they did after the charges were dropped? They campaigned against her. They said that she should be harmed. They even threatened to rape her. 2008, and I just want to please bear with me because I think this is really important as one of the strategic aspects of cases that we've had, especially in relation to Chinese people. In 2008, we were contacted at the monitoring group by a DVD seller who had just come out of prison because he was unauthorized, a gentleman called Jinhua. He had been to the police and reported his wife missing. Her name was Xiao Migao. She was only 29. The police did not react. They actually said to her, she's a DVD seller, she must have run away with money. They do not believe she was vulnerable, and that they actually said to her husband that she may have eloped with another person. We complained, we campaigned, we raised the issue, resulted in a police investigation after several months. A couple of months later, from the work we'd done, it became obvious that me had been lured by a stranger near his home while she was selling DVDs. This gentleman was called Mr. Brown. A search of Mr. Brown's flat in Rotherhithe, Southeast London, in October 2008, revealed blood from not just one, but at least two victims. In the kitchen, in the corridor, in the bathroom. And there was evidence that not only had he killed women, but he had dismembered them. Derek Brown, aged 48, was found guilty of murders of Xiaomi Gao, 29, a DVD seller, and Bonnie Barrett, 24, a sex worker whom he picked up in Whitechapel. The jury found Brown guilty of murders, despite the fact that the bodies were never found. Brown became clear at the trial, had tried to emulate Jack the Ripper, and had what was described as an appetite for sexual violence targeting Oriental women and vulnerable prostitutes. I still remember at the trial how the prosecuting barrister described May, the DVD seller. He said both women were street workers. Both were soft targets for predatory killer. May was not a sex worker. She was a DVD seller. I'm not making a judgment here, but that she's not a street worker. Let's just turn our minds just for a moment to March this year in Atlanta, the killing that took place at the Asian massage parlor. What did the shooter say? The shooter said that he did not target that woman because of their race. Instead, he claimed to be a sex addict bent on removing temptation. Regardless of his denial, whether it is a lie or self-deception, it is obvious that he targeted these women because they were Asian. In this case, the Atlanta case, in Eileen Jai's case, in Mee's case, the tragedies surrounding all these women show that racism and sexism intersect. Force in which mainly hypersexualized or objectified in popular culture. The Pulitzer winning author Viet Thanh Nguyen from America reminds us that, just quote him for a minute, a brutal version of this Oriental fantasy is found in many American movies about the war in Vietnam. Perhaps the most striking example is Stanley Kubrick's Full Metal Jacket in 1987. Underneath the sexual objectification of Asian women lurks something much more threatening. As Kubrick made clear by the end of the movie, when the Marines are picked off by a sniper, when they finally capture the shooter, they discover she's a Vietnamese teenager. The movie concludes with the Marines surrounding her, and through only one of them pulls the trigger, it is clear that this is a gang killing. The Asian woman who began as a sexual temptation ends as a mortal threat that must be eliminated by young men trained in boot camp to march with their rifles in their shoulders while they clutch their crouches, chanting, "This is my rifle, this is my gun, this is for fighting, this is for fun." The thinker and the academic, Edward Said, an American of Palestinian origin, argued British and French colonizers justified their conquest of the East and the narratives of Oriental inferiority, docility, lust, and treachery. Said was mostly thinking about the Middle East, North Africa, of Arabs and Muslims. But these eroticizing, exoticizing narratives extend to every woman in the third world, East and Southeast Asian included. The Oriental as the other is a mask that can be slit from many different people of different reasons. The second point has already been made. I don't want to illustrate more. It's actually made in some senses by our second or third speaker. It's the point that the old yellow peril is easily changeable with new yellow fever. The pervasiveness of these verbal and physical attacks, triggered in part by not just Donald Trump, but even people like Michael Gove in this country and his political supporters, characterizing COVID-19 as the China virus or Kung Flu, indicate a deep well of anti-Chinese, anti-Asian racism globally in the UK as well as in the US and in France and in Sweden and in other countries. As a colonizer, Europe and Asia have often looked at Asia as a source of wealth and danger. In the 19th century, China was the ultimate goal of expansionism. Now it is not so much a country to be exploited, but a major competitor. China has been positioned as number one threat. This will inevitably produce anti-Chinese feelings in the West. And just many Europeans and British cannot tell the difference between Chinese and other East Asians. Everyone will suffer the consequences and are beginning to suffer the consequences. Somebody's already made the point that Asian acceptability in this country has always been a contingent. In America, they're seen as model minorities, and they're seen as good migrants or immigrants in the UK. Calling to stop anti-Chinese hate will have limited impact without an awareness of the enduring history and impact of colonialism and recognition of what the empire stands for. We just cannot simply condemn when the worst happens. This is the easiest thing to do. And what we have to do as anti-racism, as people concerned about each other, is that our anti-racist traditions are understood to be proactive conduct. It could be individual resilience, it could be resistance, but it encompasses beliefs and attitudes and actions that challenges and dismantles all forms of racism, seeks to locate the root causes of those, the patterns of racism that exist globally in this country, and the impact and the purpose and the solutions that we have to find for them together. We must begin to respect each other and eradicate the marginalization, the silence, the invisibilization, the hiddenness, the exclusion, and the hurt. We must develop solidarity with our Chinese brothers and sisters and communities and shared actions with other individual people. We believe in the equality of rights, responsibilities, and promotes supportive relations across communities. We want to empower. We believe in self-organization. We believe in self-reliance, because that is for justice and fair treatment of all. If we do that, Dao and her child will get the justice that she deserves. If we do not claim our history, then this history under the present will claim us, as it did our ancestors. Thank you for listening to me.
Thank you very much for that, Suresh. That was really moving. It was really good to hear a different aspect on violence and racism against the East and Southeast Asian communities, in particular women, because we know that women often suffer the brunt of these attacks. So anyway, I just wanted to, something's been brought to our attention, that there have been people unable to join this meeting. For this, we apologise for any inconvenience caused by this. We are looking into this matter, and so sorry if anyone has missed out. I have a feeling that this will not be our last meeting on this topic. So now it's your turn. Everybody that's here, that's joined us, we want to hear your comments and, more importantly, your questions for the panel. So Chi and I will be sort of handing these out. We have one, so I'm not sure. I'm going to pass this over to Chi. I'll say, has the situation improved or changed over the years? So I presume that means what's happening to the Chinese community regarding hate crimes. So I'm thinking who to address that to. I'm going to actually address that to Bobby. If you could answer that, please, Bobby. Has the situation of hate against the East and Southeast Asian communities, the Chinese communities, changed over the years? You have to unmute yourself, Bobby.
Bobby.
Brilliant, yeah. Thank you.
I mean, I don't actually think that there are any changes to the rate of racism against the Chinese community, but in the last year, the situation is actually getting worse. I was just talking to a client of mine today. I asked him, how is your business? Because he have a small takeaway. And he said, the situation is getting worse because, I mean, when they do delivery of food, they constantly being attacked and refuse to pay. I say, why didn't you call the police? There is no point calling the police. They never do anything. So this is the kind of experience which I think where majority of a lot of the large number of the Chinese community, because a lot of us actually involved in catering trades, are actually suffering from their mistrust of the police and the institution in this country. Because recently I have clients who actually told me that at the height of the pandemic, is a very elderly person, and she was told by the council that they need to come and check their utilities like electricity and gas. So they said that's not a problem, but make sure you come with PPE, the full PPE, and they wouldn't do it. They just turned up with no PPE. They complained to the council, nothing happened. They are now actually saying, you refuse me to come into your property, I'm going to charge you instead. This is the situation. I mean, the pandemic actually made the situation a lot worse, but I don't think that there are any big changes because racism against the Chinese is always been prevalent anyway.
Okay, thanks for that, Bobby. I'm going to actually put that same question to, I think, Ping, if she's around, if she'd like to answer as well. If she's around, if not, I'll move on to the next question. No. Oh. Right, I'm going to go on to the next question. It's fine. Right.
Yeah, sorry. So
can you hear Ping?
Yeah, I can.
Okay.
Do you ask me the same question?
Yeah, it's the same question. Have you noticed the situation has changed regarding the Chinese community and attacks on the Chinese community over the years? Have you noticed a change at all?
Yeah, I think it's getting worse. But based on my personal experience and based on the friend around me, And also I attended many training programs. For example, the hate crime training program, various like CPS or different training sessions. But during the session, we have a question and answer, do a survey, quick survey. One of the questions is ask the audience, how do you feel, the situation with the racist hate crime compare 10 years ago? But majority, as overwhelmingly, people say it's getting worse. From the data, people respond based on all of them, their personal experience, as the situation is getting worse. And the other, I think, threshold is that, especially after the Brexit. So when the referendum say that we're going to leave the EU, that's actually one of another, you can see from the statistics, actually, that is another threshold when the racially hate crime actually going up. For the Chinese community, especially, and also East and Southeast communities, is the pandemic is worse as a worst case, I think.
Thanks for that, Ping. Yeah, that's really helpful. I have one question quickly for Lucian, and I'm going to also put that to Christina if she's still around. How can we collectively make the media and politicians take seriously what's been happening to the ESEA communities over the last year? So that question is going to go to Lucian firstly, if Lucian is around. Are you around, Lucian? If not, I'm going to pose that to Christina. Are you able to answer that for me, Christina? That would be great.
Yeah, I do think Lucian is still here. I see, except muted.
Yeah, sometimes people pop off, don't they? But anyway,
but yeah, I mean, I do think that in the US, I am grateful that I've been seeing many more Asian and Asian Americans speaking out against the violence. And there's been the Stop AAPI reporting center, which a lot of media outlets have used some of their data. And then there's an organization called Hate is a Virus that is doing a lot of collective social media work and trying to raise awareness through social media and partnering with Asian American celebrities and other people who are already in the media to sort of elevate the issues that are happening. But I think a lot of it has to do with people power, right? The media is only going to put things in and publish things in that they think are going to get clicks or get more views. So if we as subscribers of media challenge and make it known that we want to hear these stories and we need to see them, then I think that is very powerful, right? I don't know, I've never written a letter to the editor, but I think if we all collectively wrote to our local papers and talked about the need to see these stories, then they would take notice. Yeah, and I see Lucian raising their hand.
Yeah, that'd be great if we could. Thanks for that, Christina. Yeah, I'd like to hear from Lucian as well. What could you answer that question that I've just put to Christina, if that's okay?
Yeah, Christina has raised some really, really important points. And it comes with the fact that petitions are unlimited, letters are unlimited, they can be open, they can be directed, and they can be very clear and effective on applying pressure to those with power to use it to change the situation for our good. But it also comes with the fact that those with the power sometimes are aware of what they can do and simply don't want to. And now that comes with the fact that pressure is not simply enough when you target it towards people who can necessarily make change. It can just start with people like us who are just gathered in a Zoom meeting. One day this will be in person. And it can come with individuals and families and communities, and grassroots organizations are sometimes the most effective in dealing with this. But I was going to say that when it comes to a point that David made earlier in the chat about raising awareness that attacks are happening, the reason why I don't think it necessarily is enough is because this is what happens when you raise awareness. When you raise awareness, photos of attacks are published, articles of attacks are published, everyone knows it's going on. I think even those in rural areas who, aren't closer in proximity to Chinese people and East Asian people know this is going on. But without that historical context that Suresh was talking about, there is less empathy, and our stories of being attacked are not humanized. And then people become desensitized to seeing photos and videos of violence against people who look like us. They get used to seeing it. And when they see a new article about one of us that's been hit or killed, it does less emotionally to them. And eventually care will dissipate. So I think it does need to come with the educational need that was mentioned earlier in the chat as well, because institutions like primary schools, secondary schools, like Dao mentioned, and higher education like universities are all complicit in this. Our politicians are complicit in this. And without people who are not only Chinese and not only Asian speaking out on this, we need people of all colors and backgrounds, right? That's when things will really start mattering and shifting, I think. Sorry, I went on a bit.
No, that's
can I say something? As somebody who have worked in the media for a long time before my current work, I changed my career quite late in my life, but I did spend about 20 years in the media, in the print journalism. So I see it in a close quarter. I think one thing we have to be aware of, that the media is not neutral. That's very important for us to remember that. They all have an angle to look for, as we all see, and particularly this is particularly bad in this country, in Britain, because the British media is owned by a very, very small group of people who have a particular agenda, even a political agenda to push, and attacking minority communities. What is generally termed, the other. Is on the agenda, and we all know, those of us who live in this country, we all know what these newspapers are: the Daily Mail, the Daily Telegraph. I used to work for the Sun, and they are the one who champion any kind of right-wing agenda. And equally, politicians won't do anything unless there are pressure for them to do something. I think the whole thing about what's happening in America last summer through the whole George Floyd thing is the Black Lives Matter has shown us that only when we are organized and organized well, and also organized in a kind of cross-community alliance fashion, things will start to happen. It's no accident that this hate crime legislation just been signed into law by President Biden has both in Congress have a bipartisan support. There's no accident, because there are enormous pressure to do that. In this country, it's much harder. We in the Chinese community have to be A, very visible, and B, we have to forge alliance with other groups and give them support. Give them support when they needed the support. For example, we know what's going on with the Palestinian at the moment. People like that need support, and in return they will give us support when we need it. Same with the Black community. I think Suresh made a very good point earlier on. It's about that we do have to be, respect each other, and we have to make this alliance. And as John McDonnell said earlier on, solidarity is the key. It's the key for all of us. Although we always refer to it as a minority community, but collectively we're quite a large group. And also, given the community, such as the Asian community and the Chinese community in this country, there's a large, our community no longer like it was 40, 30 years ago. We have a large group of people, especially young people, my children, their friends, and people of Lucian's age, and who are well educated. We need to use educated. There's a duty on us as people who are, educated, to fight on behalf of our community to actually make the community more visible, make us count at the end of the day. Because fundamentally, we pay tax, whether you talk about the police for like Dara was saying early on, if they're not doing their job, that's why organization like the TMG, like Min Quan, is actually very important, because accountability in this country has just gone out of the window. We have politicians with a prime minister who are not accountable at the moment to anyone, and not least of all the media who's supposed to make who's supposed to raise this issue are not doing that. So coming back to the original question is that how do we raise the awareness by the media and the politician? Well, we do it by being more visible, by being more vocal, by when injustice is happening, we take part. We say this is wrong, this is wrong, and we do something about it, and we also support, regardless whatever community that is happening to. We support them, and we seek alliances with them, and that is the way to go.
Thanks for that, Chi. Yeah, lots of comments in the chat about you speaking about the media, more or less saying that, yeah, the media is very biased. Not everyone's brave enough to report personal attacks. This is a question, actually. I'm going to pose this to Suresh. Not everyone is brave enough to go and report personal attacks. What can the monitoring group do to help to encourage the Chinese Asian community to go public about their personal racial attack experience? That's to you, Suresh.
It's totally understandable that people don't want to report for, risk of reprisals, risk of intimidation, impact on their personal lives. Totally understand that. And I think when it comes to reporting, the most important things that have happened in this country are threefold. Before the Lawrence inquiry, I don't know whether people know what I mean by the Lawrence inquiry. I don't want to go into the detail, but basically, after the Stephen Lawrence murder, there was a public judicial inquiry because of the failures of police. And that inquiry in 1998 made a number of recommendations and therefore developed changes in legislation, policies, and practices. And one of the things that was that one of the things that changed dramatically was the definition of a race incident. For example, only the police ascertained what was racist. Now it's based not just on evidence, but actually people's perception. And anybody apart from the police, including the police, can say that it has to be recorded and investigated. So if people want to do it anonymously, they can do that, and they can do it through various ways. It'll be recorded, and then it'll be investigated. We argued that people don't have to go to police stations to report it. There should be third-party reporting centers, which are not linked to the police. So the Lawrence inquiry made that recommendation. It was accepted by the government. So there are third-party reporting centers people can go to. The monitoring group is a third-party report center. People come to us anonymously. They can use the email or our website to report an incident. If you are anonymous, the police may record it but not investigate it. Give you an example. The case that I spoke about in relation to the DVD seller, both of them were undocumented workers, and they wanted to. And before the husband wanted to report his wife missing, he came to us, said, "I don't want to be arrested for being an undocumented worker. How do I manage to report the missing?" We met the police. We created a system so he could report it safely, and then the issue could be investigated. So there are ways of doing that. There are ways of being flexible about reporting a race incident. Hate crime is seen as one of the most serious things. But the problem we have at the moment is, I've been to a number of meetings. I know some other people have been to meetings with the police over the last year, which take place on a weekly or bi-weekly basis. Frankly, I found those meetings to be talking shops. I don't go there because it's just even when you discuss cases, there's no real ownership of what happens to these cases. To me, it's a public exercise that the South Asian community, because in UK, the South Asian community is known as Asian, whereas in US, it's the Chinese and the Southeast Asian. So the South Asian communities here and the African Caribbean communities, if I can call that, have raised these issues in very different ways. We've been through all that process. We don't need to learn the same lessons. There are things that work that they don't have to be reinvented. The issue about the Chinese communities feeling unsafe to report can be dealt with practically. But I think what changes attitude isn't just petitions. It definitely makes a difference with media when you have petitions. But I think with politicians, there's nothing more important than three things. Firstly, they respond to personal tragedies, unfortunately, better than to statisticals and data. They respond to so-called evidence, which is gathered by academics. But most of the research that's being done at the moment is not research to change things, it's just to think and to lay out the stuff. The kind of research we need, which makes a difference, which is about a continuation of thinking and acting. So active research models, which allow us to lay the picture, look at the evidence, and then propose changes which can be implemented. It can't just be just laying it out for the process of thinking and not acting. So impact, active, action-based researches will make the difference, not just academic research for the sake of academic research, which is actually what's being developed at the moment. And I think the media can play a role in making it safer to report issues to do with racism or hate crimes for Chinese people. We need the vernacular media to become much more safer and open. Social media is a fantastic vehicle for people to report incidents. I don't want to monopolize, but that's all I have to say. Thank you for asking me that question.
Okay, I see in the chat that Lucian wanted to answer that question. Is that still the case, Lucian? Do you have anything to say, following on from what Suresh has said? Thank you, Suresh.
Yeah, really thanks for Suresh and Dorothea and everyone at the monitoring group for doing so much that they do. And because a large part of how Chinese people feel safe, or other East Asian people feel safe to speak out about these issues, is they consider, once I speak out about this, what is the chain of events that is going to occur when I say that this has happened to me, right? And I'm sure, Dao, you all have had the same train of thought when you were like, right, my son just came to me, told me this happened, where do I go? And when I go there, what's going to happen? And so a large part of this is the non-Chinese people and non-Asian people in the equation. But at the same time, within the Asian community in the UK, it's different, because in America, Christina, you'll understand this, that there are more Chinese people in America, and there is a more of a consensus and community feeling that the UK does not necessarily have when it comes to us and Chinese people, right? I've seen communities form because of religion and Christian and Buddhist groups, but outside of that, there is less concentration of us, and we're more spread out, and we're just sort of the only Asian Chinese family in the school, or the only one at work, and there is a lack of understanding, and we don't feel seen and we don't feel understood. So I think it really starts from the small things, and those are things that Asian Unity Over Fear are trying to do. We are having meetings, for example, about just different topics. One topic will be education, primary school, telling stories about what it was like to go to school, being taught only by white people, only having white friends, and that feeling of ostracization and that feeling of being alone. And once we feel seen, and once we know that other Chinese people are listening, that's where I think the confidence comes from, because just being told by people who don't necessarily look like you that you'll be okay isn't as reassuring as when someone who looks like you tells you you'll be fine. And I think that's just how humans work. But yeah, it needs to come within the Asian community itself.
Thanks for that. Yeah, that was a very comprehensive answer. Thanks so much for that, Lucian. Yeah, I'm honestly, every time I hear you speak, I'm thinking, wow, she's a powerhouse at age just 19. I've got another question. I'm not sure who to put this to. I'm going to read it out. We qualitatively know the causes of racism against UK, CE, SEA, so that's obviously Chinese, South and Southeast Asian communities. What research is available or being done to give us a rigorous foundation to address the causes and bring in other mainstream stakeholders to this movement against anti, sort of Chinese Southeast Asian hate? So I'm trying to think how I want to address that too, really. I don't know if Ping would like to answer this. I'm not sure. Otherwise, I'll move along. Does anyone want to raise their hand? That may be helpful, actually, so that I don't want to exclude anybody. I want to make sure that whoever wants to answer a question can answer a question or put it in the chat. Okay, I'm going to put that out because I haven't heard from Ping unless she wants to answer. I'm going to put that to you, Suresh, because it's about research and yeah, I thought it'd either be you or Ping to answer that, or possibly Christina as well.
I'll let Christina go in.
Yeah, go for it, Christina. Do you want to have a go?
Yeah, well, so most of the resources I know are US based, so I don't know how helpful it would be for folks who are listening in, but I can drop some links in the chat box. I did a little earlier. A report from Virulent Hate just came out a couple of days ago, but that's US based. So they analyze news reports of anti-Asian hate, and so they like cross-reference like what geographic regions in the US, what kinds of hate violence, and then also when it was indicated in the reports, like what racial groups committed those acts, and then also what ethnicities of Asian like were experiencing them. So trying to break down this myth that it's like just Chinese people that are experiencing this hate. And then there's a couple other reporting agencies that have released reports that I can pop in the chat box. But again, I don't know UK-based research that well. So if I find anything, I can send it to the monitoring group after this session. And if they want to send it out to people, then they can do that. Yes.
Thanks for that, Christina. If anyone's got any links on UK-based data as well, that would be surveys or any research, that would be really helpful if they could put that in the chat, because I think, you know, we want to hear what's going on in the US, but we also want to hear what's happening here and you know, to read up and see what can be done. There was a question, actually, it was about the takeaway murder case. I think this question's either for Bobby or Suresh. The name, somebody wanted the name for that. I don't know if anyone's got that or could put that in the chat. It doesn't necessarily have to go out. Does anyone have the name for that or not?
Sorry, which
we can't hear you, Suresh. Unmute yourself, please. We can't hear you. Suresh, you need to unmute yourself.
Yeah, I'll put the name on the chat.
Yeah.
It's actually quite well-known case. It's also in the report, so I'll just put the name in on the chat now and email everyone about the details if you want, no problem.
Okay. Well, if there are no other questions, I really I'm going to sort of bring this meeting to an end. I want to actually say thank you to our panel of speakers. Weren't they amazing? I'd also like to thank everybody, all of you, for attending from all over the world, and also for the people that couldn't get in. I'm so sorry again. This is recorded and it will go out on the monitoring group's Facebook in the next few days, so you will be able to see this meeting. We're so pleased you attended, and also I'd like to say thank you to Jan Powell, who has painstakingly monitored the chat today at very short notice. And also thank you to Ashik, our tech guy behind the scenes, you know, who's made all of this happen, to be honest. Thank you so much for everybody, and thank you so much for attending. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Oh, what's happened?